How to paint autumn. I start by using Pexels.com to pick out a reference image by Johannes Plenio. I then mix out a palette that gives me a range to every hue in the image. My first step is mixing some water into some light blue acrylic paint and using it as a wash on the first layer of the canvas. I chose a blue stain to make the orange leaves of the fall landscape really pop on top. I then take that same blue and use it to start blocking in my general composition. In this painting, I have an almost grave shape in the distance where all of the light seems to come from. I then paint the tree line that points towards this distant grave shape. I then use a light bluish white to paint in that grave shape, painting outside of the lines a bit to show the light pouring over. I then wrap a faded light green around that center shape. I repeat this process and continue to make each layer of green a little bit darker. This really gives us the illusion that that white in the center is distant light coming from the end of a forest pathway. If you can, try and make each layer of green a little bit wider than the next. That'll help with the illusion too. After that, go in with a very light faded orange on your most distant strip of that pathway. Continue that orange color downwards towards the bottom of the canvas, getting increasingly darker and more saturated. This too will give us the illusion that that pathway is fading into a misty distance. And just like that, you've completed your first layer. Next, go in with a light gray blue and paint in those skinny trees off in the distance. The further away you want something to look, the lighter and bluer it should be. Next, I use some faded yellow to paint in some of those bright yellow bushes that are also off in the distance. I further that sense of depth by adding in a little more yellow the more we round that pathway corner. Next, I take some more light, warm green and paint in some bowing branches over this pathway. Whenever you're painting an actual branch, it will always be on the underside of the leaves that grow on top of it. I make sure to be very delicate with these lines as they're quite a ways away in the distance. Next, I use an even darker grayish blue to paint in layers of trees that are getting even closer to the foreground. I let their branches wrap up around the pathway too, and fill in any gaps on the sides with more tree trunks. I use a slightly darker green than the one before to paint those leaves bowing over the same pathway. Don't be afraid to cover up some of the work you've already done. This will help create a layered effect, which is exactly what we're looking for. I continue down the path towards the viewer with darker tree trunks reaching up into the canopy. To get nice organic tree shapes, I highly recommend that you pay close attention to your reference image, and if there aren't a lot of trees in your reference image, try accessing some other images to help you get that really nice, realistic tree shape. I then go in with a bright yellow and start to dab on all of those bright colored leaves in the foreground. I use a lot of paint on my brush for this because I want these leaves to really stand out and look bright. Using these small dabbing motions really helps create the illusion of these big clusters of leaves. My darkest purpley blue color will go on my final tree trunk closest to the foreground. Just like the lighter something is, the further away it feels, the darker something is, the closer to the viewer it feels. I fill in some of my blank spaces with more tree trunks that are a lighter blue so that they do look further away. Then, I go in with more of my yellow and start to paint in this really beautiful yellow brush that I'm seeing in my reference image. Again, I'm using these small dabbing motions with my brush and being patient as I allow them to build up and really create a sense of form and direction. Try not to get lazy with this and continue to check your reference image as you go along. My image let me know that the leaves get slightly more orange as they near the top of the composition. Details like these can really make or break your painting. We now move to the other side of the pathway, where we follow that same rule of the tree trunks getting slightly darker the further that they move towards the foreground. Just for clarification, the foreground means the viewpoint, or the person taking the picture in this case. So our darkest tree is closest to the foreground. I go back in with that bright orange and bright yellow to continue to paint those beautiful clusters of leaves cascading off of those bending branches. I use some of the yellow brush to express distance in between the two trees in the foreground. By having the leaves poke out in front of one tree and behind another, it shows that one is closer to the viewer than the other. It's easy to forget that forests aren't just about trees. There is a lot of bushes and brush to be painted in as well. It's easy to get caught up in all of these fall colors, but don't forget to use green too. After finishing our tree line, I go in and start to add details into that leafy pathway. In my reference image, this pathway is absolutely covered with colored leaves. You can really get this texture by building up layers of those same little marks you were using as leaves on the trees. Pay attention to areas where there's more of one color than another. This will really help things not look too muddy and look a little more realistic along the way. And after all of that hard work, we finally have ourselves a gorgeous fall landscape. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you try it out.